So we're continuing our series for August. We're focusing on the legacy of our co-founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, who were both born this month. I think we got some pictures of them up here. That's Charles when he had a beard, and Myrtle. He was born August 22nd. Myrtle's birthday was just this last Tuesday. They've given us a legacy that really is something that we can use today to try to keep unity from becoming irrelevant in the face of our expanding knowledge and all the new discoveries that seem to be keep coming on every day. And I think it's a fair assessment to say that religion, for the most part, has been an obstacle to new ideas and new discoveries. I think everybody knows the story of Galileo, right? Placed under house arrest by the Catholic Church for daring to say that the earth revolved around the sun. There's another name, though, that we may not be so familiar with. Giordano Bruno. He was an Italian astronomer, also a Dominican friar, who was convicted of heresy for daring to suggest that the sun was just one of a vast number of heavenly bodies in an infinite universe. Now, in order to escape death as a heretic, all he had to do was recant. All he had to do was to say simply that there are no other worlds. There are no other worlds. But he knew better. So he refused, and in 1600, well, they did what they did to a lot of heretics back then. They burned him at the stake. And it's not all about those kinds of dark and violent episodes. On a little lighter note, I can recall when I was in 5th grade attending a Catholic school outside of Chicago. I got to see history being made. An earth-shattering event took place at Mass one day. They actually let a guy play a guitar for some of the songs. I kid you not, that's what passed for progressive in 1969, guitar music in church. However, they drew the line at a piano. No, sir, guitars maybe, but no piano, right? The only proper keys in church are organ keys. I have no idea why, but the usual reasoning goes like this. Because that's the way we've always done it. God's favorite music is organ music. And apparently he'll grudgingly tolerate a guitar, but pianos, oh, no. So that's one extreme, way over here, right? Stuck in the past, hidebound, that's a term we use for it. There's an opposite extreme, and the one over here is where we go chasing after every shiny new object being carried on the latest spiritual bandwagon. We call it pop fad spirituality. It can be just as bad as the other extreme. So, here's what we have. Over here, you get stuck in the past and fail to evolve. Over at the other extreme, you become so busy hopping around from one thing to another that you lose all sense of depth. Never get to fully test an idea or a concept. Those are the two extremes. We're looking for the sweet spot somewhere in the middle. And last week, you may have noticed in your bulletin in the handout there was a quote from Charles Fillmore that I didn't share during the talk. I think it captures the essence of what our co-founders were trying to do, another major part of their legacy. This is how Charles described unity, which at that time he would also refer to as practical spirituality, or practical Christianity, I should say. Practical Christianity. He used those terms interchangeably. Here's what he said. It has no dogmas nor creeds, nor are its students expected to believe anything which they cannot logically demonstrate to be true. Thus, it does not in any manner partake of the popular concept of religion as a vague something which has to be accepted on faith and believed regardless of its consistencies. On the contrary, it invites the closest mental scrutiny. There's a reason why the Fillmores settled in Missouri. You know what the unofficial nickname is for Missouri? That's right, the Show Me State. Show me, prove it. Charles would use that term practical Christianity, meaning that practical means that it has to work in the real world. You have to be able to see it working. You have to be able to experience it working. So I think that's one of the ways that we can stay relevant. Keep it real. Keep it practical. Make sure that whatever we're presenting is backed up by evidence and real-world experience. That's not an easy thing to do because our knowledge of the world is constantly shifting and changing and expanding. Here's an example. You know, the Fillmores would talk a lot about health and healing. They had a lot to say on health and healing at a time when medical science was very, very primitive and limited. They lived at a time when germ theory was just starting to be proven as a practical reality. In the mid-1800s, it was just starting to come into medical and scientific consensus. And the consensus was that there are these tiny things that you couldn't see with the naked eye, like microbes and viruses and things like that, that could cause illness and disease. And Charles and Myrtle, they eventually accepted the idea that microbes could cause illness, but they decided that the only reason that there were these harmful microbes in the first place is because human beings were thinking bad thoughts, which somehow brought them into existence. It was the misuse of human consciousness that caused bad microbes. An interesting hypothesis at a time when there really were no effective antibiotics. An interesting hypothesis. The problem, though, is that at the time, they didn't know how old the Earth and the universe really were. They didn't know that microbes had been in existence for thousands of millions of years before there was anything even resembling human life in the universe. Millions of years before there were even things that we might recognize as plants. In other words, microbes existed for millions of years before there was human consciousness. That's a bit of a problem for that hypothesis, isn't it? They didn't know about the Big Bang Theory and the other discoveries that would come along in the early to mid-1900s that would demonstrate how microbes and all the other life forms in the universe originated and developed, and then the order in which they developed. And that was the knowledge that eventually led to antibiotics, which have proven to be far more effective in fighting infection than just about anything else. The moral of the story is that sometimes we have to be willing to release cherished ideas that have been overtaken by events and new knowledge. Now, scientists are generally very good at doing that because sometimes they spend years working on a particular hypothesis only to reach a dead end. And if the hypothesis is wrong, well, you can try again. Maybe you did something wrong in all those experiments, or you can reformulate the hypothesis based on what you learned and move on. You know, one of the reasons I think that we call unity a movement, we refer to it as the unity movement, is because we're willing to move on. At least I hope so. Because the words that we often use to describe things that have ceased to move on aren't things that we want to be called. Words like moribund, stagnant, irrelevant, torpid, that's a good one, torpid, and of course, dead, right? None of those things are good. None of those things are good. 10 years ago in 2009, the always witty Garrison Keillor wrote something interesting on the topic that I think is particularly appropriate now. He said, on the other hand, you don't want to be the last man to believe in the mission after everyone else has seen the light and gone home. Sunday in San Francisco, they set out to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Woodstock by gathering 3,000 guitarists in Golden Gate Park to play Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze. And 50 showed up. and some of them were playing ukuleles. The 60s are over. Time to move on. And that's a true story from what I've been able to tell. They did try to get all these guitars. They're going to break the Guinness World Record for guitars playing Purple Haze, and it was a miserable failure, I guess. But this is particularly appropriate because you know what next weekend is? Next weekend is the 50th anniversary of Woodstock, right? And you know, this time they had planned this great big commemorative concert at the same place as the original, but they ended up having to cancel it for various reasons, a certain amount of lack of interest, lack of organization, problems like that. But the real point is, it's over. It's time to move on. And I'm sure that there's going to be some guy showing up at a cow pasture in Bethel, New York next weekend with his ukulele, looking around and wondering where all the people are. You don't want to be that guy. Time to move on. And nobody's saying it's easy. No one is saying that it's easy to let go and move on. It's challenging to stay informed. It's challenging to question our ideas and assumptions, especially the ones that we cherish, that we're attached to. It requires patience, attention, concentration. You know, people say we live in an information age, and some people call it information overload. I frequently hear people who say, oh, there's just too much information to make sense of. How do we know what's really true? And I'm afraid that that's dangerously close to saying, I'm not up to the challenge of sorting and discerning, and I'd really just rather have someone tell me what to think. And believe me, there's plenty of people that are willing to do that. You know, at least that's an honest admission. But we're selling ourselves short because I think we're all up to the challenge. The problem, though, is that the truth can set us free, but it also imposes certain limits. You know there's an old saying that is actually misattributed to Gloria Steinem. She didn't really say it, but she gets the credit for it. The truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off, right? That's being perfectly honest. We don't like it. Oh, that's true, but we don't like it. We don't want to hear it. It doesn't confirm what we want to believe about the world. And so often we find all sorts of devious ways to avoid facing the truth. Outright denial or things like that. I kind of like what one of our country's co-founders, John Adams, once said on the subject. He said, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. So one of the core messages that I get from the Fillmores, which I think is still alive and relevant today, is that it's okay to follow the facts and the evidence to wherever it leads, even if it means that we have to give up a cherished core belief or two or three along the way. You know, we won't lose anything. We won't lose our sense of wonder and awe. We won't cease to matter as individuals. In fact, I think awe and wonder can actually increase. And we might even discover that life is more meaningful and that we matter more than we thought before. You know, for the past few years, we've been doing this monthly class called The Frontiers of Consciousness. I think it's safe to say what we've learned over that time is that we're far from a complete understanding of what consciousness is, the exact process, but everything seems to be pointing to some kind of a complex physical process. I mentioned last week that I think it's likely to turn out that way. And if that proves to be the case, it won't change our experience. Not one bit. We're still going to have to deal with being conscious, self-aware beings on a planet where we have to get along with other conscious, self-aware beings. And together we have to contemplate the absurdity of life and our mortality and things like that. You know, the full catastrophe, as Zorba the Greek used to say. We're still going to have to deal with all of that. You know, our entire experience of life is dependent on the thoughts, the emotions, the memories that make up human consciousness. None of that's going to change. I think sometimes we're afraid that once we're able to explain something from a physical and mechanical perspective, it becomes dull and boring and is going to lose something. I'm not sure where that comes from. Anybody still like to look at rainbows? Anybody still dig rainbows? I mean, I go out and take pictures of them when they appear, right? Well, the great romantic poet John Keats once accused Isaac Newton of destroying, I tell you, the poetry of the rainbow by explaining how water droplets act like a prism. Unweaving the rainbow, he said. We know exactly how and why rainbows form. And I think that's even more mysterious and awesome. All these water droplets up there, all these mini prisms dividing the light into the colors. Oh, that's way more cool than thinking that it's fairy dust or something like that. So we know all this, and they're no less beautiful. We still admire and appreciate them. And Keats went on, unfortunately, to die of tuberculosis, like most people did in those days. Unfortunate, but we want to keep moving and not be weighed down by this unfounded fear that somehow we diminish our experience of life by increasing our knowledge. And it's a process. This is the piece we tend to forget. This process invites more than a little humility, because we're not even close to being able to explain everything. There was a time when shortly around the time that Newton published his great works, they thought, oh heck, we're just about able to explain everything in the universe, right? Well, here's a graphic showing how that actually breaks down. Here it is. That tiny green sliver over there, that's the stuff we know. The slightly larger blue sliver over there is the stuff you know you don't know. And the rest of it is the stuff you don't know you don't know.
I don't know.
Plenty of mysteries left to solve, plenty of new wonders to behold, but we're not even going to encounter the mystery if we're not willing to move on, and we're not certainly going to encounter the wonders unless we're willing to get out there and look. We have to be willing to move on. And that's about all the time that I have this morning. It's time for me to move on. See you next weekend.